Jesus. So what we're going to look at today is a couple weeks ago we looked at two comforts of false teachers. You say, how is it comforting to have false teaching? Well, one, we know it's been going on since the garden with the devil, right? Did God really say the day you eat you shall surely die? Surely you won't. So what we deal with as Christians today is some facts is more than 4 years old, which to me is comforting. Secondly, we looked at 2 weeks ago, we can take comfort in the fact that God is just and right, not only to punish false teachers because he historically has, but also to preserve his children. You know, one thing about the internet, I love the internet because of all the cool pictures of hats, or of cats in hats I get to see, and raccoons in hats. Man, if it was back in the 60s and 70s, you could go your entire life without seeing a picture of a raccoon wearing a hat. And now, if you're friends with my wife and I get a hold of her phone, you can get like 3 of those in an hour, right? I love that part of the internet, but the other part of the internet is that there's so much false teaching that's prevalent. You know, you get onto Facebook, you go no more than 30 seconds of scrolling, and you see 3 people quoting the same scripture saying entirely different things, and none of them have to do with what the Bible's talking about. You know, and you look at it and you're like, oh man, how can I even deal with this? Man, let me tell you this. The church has been dealing with that kind of garbage for years, and God has carried the church through. And if you're a believer, let me tell you this. God will carry you through this very uncertain time of false information, alternative facts, and bold-faced lies. And God's good to punish those who peddle that. What we're going to be looking at the back half of our 2-part sermon today is simply this. The reason why, the warning why we need as believers to avoid these false teachers. We saw the comfort. Now we're going to see the fallout for those who follow it. Let me go ahead and read. I invite you to stand with me for the reading of God's Word. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 10 through 22. I'll go ahead and start reading. He says this, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. Bold and willful, they do not tremble as they blaspheme the glorious ones. Whereas angels, though greater in might and power, do not pronounce a blasphemous judgment against them before the Lord. But these, like irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters which they are ignorant, will also be destroyed in their destruction. Suffering wrong as the wage for their wrongdoing, they count it a pleasure to revel in the daytime. They are blots and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions while they feast with you. They have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. They have hearts trained in greed, accursed children. Verse 15, forsaking the right way, they have gone astray. They have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the gain from wrongdoing, but he was rebuked for his own transgression. A speechless donkey spoke with a human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. I love that phrase, prophet's madness. Verse 17, these are waterless springs and mists driven by a storm. For them the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved. For speaking loud boasts of follies, they entice by sensual passions of the flesh those who are barely escaping from those who live in error. They promise them freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption. For whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. For if they have escaped the defilements of the world through the knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and they are again entangled in them and overcome, the last state has become worse for them than the first. For it would have been better for them never to have known the way of righteousness than after knowing it, turn them back to the holy commandment delivered to them. The true proverb says, has happened this to them. The dog returns to his own vomit, and the sow, after washing herself, returns to wallow in the mire. Let's pray. Jesus, thanks for this day. Thank you so much for giving me and Deb and Jude and Ezra and Mabel and Chloe a really good church family that we can do life together with and that we can weather informational storms with. I thank you so much for being the rock that gives us good and real information. Help us cling to what is true. Help us believe our beliefs and doubt our doubts. Thank you, and I love you. In your name I pray. Amen. All right, so in the back half of the chapter, what Peter starts doing here is he starts giving the description and the MO, the modus operandi, I think, of false teachers. We're going to see, first point, that false teachers are bold in their sin. And we're going to see in the second point that false teachers' promises only lead to slavery. That's where it winds up. So false teachers are bold in their sin. They go hard, they don't go home. And then where they land is only slavery. That's all that following false teachers gets us as believers. Let's go ahead and look at the first half, bold in their sin. So when we get to verse 10 is kind of neat because it's a transition verse. When we started reading, it's clear that he picked up on the end of his thought, but then there's a period and he switches it. And the first half of the passage goes, all right, hey, God was faithful to condemn the angels who believed the false teaching of Lucifer, to condemn the people, Noah's peers, for mocking Noah, and to condemn Sodom and Gomorrah for going whole hog into sin. And we looked at this a couple weeks ago, the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's more than just sexual sin. It's pride. It's suppressing the truth of God. It's mistreating the immigrant. It's mistreating the downtrodden. We learned that over in Ezekiel, I think, chapter 16, verse 32, right? And then he goes, these people were really wicked. And let me tell you about wicked people, wicked teachers, church. These wicked teachers, they're bold and they are willful. They don't tremble at the blasphemy and the glorious ones. And he starts out and he gives these two words, bold and willful. And the first one sounds like a really good Doritos kind of chip, right? Am I the only one who goes after the bold chips? Oh, man. I'm always disappointed. I'm like, oh, man, this is really going to give my taste buds a kick in the pants. Then I eat it. I'm like, that's not bold. If anything, it's just loud. I've got to write a letter. That's why my keyboard's full of chips, right? But he goes on, and what he's talking about here is really interesting. It's brazen. It's irreverent. So think of all the comedians that are popular now, or even the comedians back in the 60s and 70s like Richard Pryor, very brazen for his time. Eddie Murphy with his special Raw. I've never seen it and cannot endorse it, but if you've seen it and know what I may be talking about, that's a very, raw, but very bold comedy set. That's what it is. That's what false teaching is, because there's this set of rules, regulations, guidelines, and ethics that we have as Christians that begins with submitting to Jesus. And when you don't submit to Jesus, but rather be stiff-necked and hard-backed and stand to get him, that's bold. It is. And then the phrase willful, let me talk that out real quick. What it means there is self-obsessed. In these three words, bold and willful, what Peter's doing is he's describing people who are so self-absorbed and so, invested in themselves and what they want that everybody else gets stomped on for them to get their own ends. Now, what's really interesting is we see this idea cropping up and popping up a lot in American culture over the decades. A really good example of this is, I always get his name wrong. I get him confused with the lizard. Gordon Gekko, there we go, back in the 80s. Greed is good. Or Jordan Belfont, the Wolf of Wall Street. I think they made a movie about that, right? Or even back in the 20s with the Flappers, all right, I'm going to get mine. Or the famous Queen song that became Dr. Pepper's catchphrase, I want it all and I want it now. Even now, the live your truth, do what's right for you. Or the phrase that sounds good but can become very insidious, I got to do what's right for me, or I got to do what's right for my family. And you're like, well, what's wrong with that? I've seen so many men and women throw their community and people under the bus because it's right for them, or because I got to do what's right for me and mine. Or even the phrase, I got to get mine, right? That is bold and willful in the face of Jesus Christ. And when when false teachers begin taking us on a detour from Christ, detour is too charitable of a word because that implies you come back to Jesus. When they take us on the wrong exit, on the highway to Jesus, there we go, it really flies in the face of Jesus. Let's continue. Let's start looking at this, right? There we go. Yeah, it's in the Bible, Larry. He says, whereas angels, though greater in might and power, they don't pronounce blasphemous judgment against them before the Lord. So what Peter starts doing is he's comparing these bold and willful false teachers with these angels who are more powerful than people. Now, the Bible doesn't talk a lot about angels because that's not the point of the Bible. What the Bible does say about angels, and the idea that you get when you read through the Bible and angels show up, is they're more powerful than people. I can't fly. I can for about 6 inches for about a second and a half if I jump off the stage. That's it, right? 6 inches is pretty, yeah, maybe, probably not, right? I'm a heavy person. I'm not going to fly for very long. If anything, I'm like Buzz Lightyear. I'm falling with style, right? Angels, on the other hand, what do? Of course they can fly, right? Yeah, and you look through all these things, angels, they don't give, they're not given to marriage, so they're above any kind of lust. They're eternal beings. They were created before Adam and Eve, and they keep going. And you look over in Hebrews 1, and it says that God has made Christ, when he came to earth, even lower than angels. And the angels, when they look at Jesus on the earth, they look at the wonder of the cross because of how weak Jesus made himself, right? And these angels, they're stronger than us. And you think, since they're stronger than us, they could sin worse than us. That makes sense, right? I'm stronger than my 4-year-old son. So it stands to reason that, in theory, I could break more of the house than my 4-year-old son. Now, that hasn't happened yet, and he's a very tenacious little guy, so that may or may not be possible. But that's the logic that Peter's flowing here. Surely angels, since they're stronger, since they're greater, they could blaspheme more, but lo and behold, they don't, compared to these false teachers. And that's a really interesting statement, because whenever you read about the supernatural, I'm not prone to the supernatural. There was that show, I enjoyed half of the first episode, and it terrified the person I was watching it, so I can't watch it anymore. But whenever you look at the supernatural, right, or things, supernatural things in the Bible, or supernatural stories, or UFO sightings, there's these, they're grand and eerie, big feats of strength, and that's not them when it comes to blaspheming against God, And I think the reason for that is because they don't go so hard against the Lord. Let me read a cool passage where it talks about how we as Christians are supposed to act in the name of the Lord, right? And you could take this and go, well, if Christians act this way, surely angels, they follow a similar thing. I think they do. Jesus, when he's giving directions to the disciples, back before he was crucified, in Matthew 10, it says this: Jesus sent the 12 out, instructed them, don't go anywhere near the Gentiles, don't enter the town of Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and proclaim as you go, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You've received without paying, give without pay, right? And he goes on and he starts giving these instructions for people as they're giving the good news of Jesus. And he says, when you do, bring a coat, don't bring a second. God's going to be your second coat. He's going to take care of you, right? When you go into somebody's house, don't request payment for services rendered. Give what they give you, but don't ask for more. If you go and you minister and they reject you, don't cause a big stink about it. Go to the edge of town, dust off your sandals. That's kind of a symbol of I'm done with you, and move on to the next town. And that's how we as believers are supposed to interact with non-believers, right? Now, obviously, when you look at church culture nowadays, that's how we do things universally across the evangelical spectrum, right? Who would say, yeah, absolutely, we're really charitable with each other. We're not trying to take extra money. I mean, you're not going to find like $600,000 hidden in a church's bathroom somewhere. That's never going to happen, right? Why do you guys laugh? Did that happen in the news this week? Did it really? Oh, man. Well, hopefully it wasn't in a large church with a well-known preacher, because that would make us as Christians look terrible, right? Oh, it did? Yeah, but what we see, and even jokingly looking at it this week, is there's a difference between how we as believers, how angels as followers of the Lord conduct ourselves, and how people who claim to be believers, who are really bold and selfish in the face of God, do. There's that gap that Peter's getting after. You continue on and look at how Peter continues to describe them. He says this. He says, but these, and I love this phrase, like irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, they blaspheme about matters of which they're ignorant. Now, this is a really interesting thing. That Peter is setting this down, and this follows out through the end of the text, that these false teachers, like irrational animals, it's in their blood, it's in their instincts, man, just can't help themselves. It's like when on Thursday morning, when our church family so generously sends home the extra sweets on Wednesday nights. On Wednesday, we all eat together, and I always draw the short straw, and they always make me take home the extra brownies. And they say, well, Larry, this is for Deb. And I go, you're right, it is, but we know it's not going to make it to her. And they go, we know, but it's for her. And it's their way of keeping their belts trim at the expense of mine. That's what it is. I'm on to you guys, all right? I know that. I'm aware of it. You're like, I'm going to buy 3 extra years. Larry's young. He can take those 3 extra years. I'm not going to be around to deal with it in his 60s. It's fine. We'll send him home with a full tray of brownies, right? Extra Crisco, nothing but lard, right? Right? It's in my nature when I get up in the middle of the night to walk by and pause at the brownies when I'm getting myself a drink of water. I can't. It's something I struggle with as a Christian, as a person, that gluttony, right? It's like the winter geese flying, or it's like the snow geese flying south for the winter. It's in their DNA. It's in their blood. When we look at these bold false teachers who hitch themselves on the wagon that is opposed to Jesus Christ, and they stand against Jesus as big as they can, bold and willful, man, it's who they are. They can't not do that. Like my mouth can't not water at 2 in the morning. Like snow geese can't fly south when it hits September, October, November. You know, the Lord's aware of this. You know, we talk about this a lot in church, the idea that people, all of us, because we live in a sinful world, we're broken. There's this doctrine in the Bible called total depravity of man. We are depraved, we are broken in totality. Nobody rises above it. In fact, God even gets it this way in the book of Jeremiah when he's talking to his own holy city. God says this, can the Ethiopian change his skin color, or can the leopard change his spots? What's the obvious answer? Unless you're the king of pop, no, absolutely not. Then also, you can't do good who are accustomed to evil. This thing about false teachers or people who are following false teaching, a lot of times it sounds good. It sounds appealing. It sounds appetizing. Later on in the text, we get the word sensuality. A lot of times we reduce that to like sexual things. It's not. It's things that feel good. Eating feels good. Drinking feels good. Sleeping for 12 hours, if you hit it right, feels really good. Those are all, according to the Bible, there we go, sensual things that feel good. And false teachers can't help but pitch that to us as believers. But there's this turn when you get to verses 12 and 13. Let me read it to you guys. He says this. It's a really neat, a really neat turn of phrase. He says, blaspheming about matters which they're ignorant, they will be destroyed in their destruction, suffering wrong as the wage for their wrongdoing. You know, I love this because he's using the same word here. The thing that they're destroying people with, that's what they're destroyed by. The wrong that they're doing to people, that's how they're going to be done wrong. And what we see, and what you can even look at, in the past 2,000 years, is that idea. Jesus sums it up very shortly on the early morning of his death, when he gets done praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he rises up, and Judas is there, and he's got the whole Roman guard there, and they've got their torches and their pitchforks. And Judas comes up and he betrays him with a kiss, right? It'd be like me betraying you with a friendly hug. And Jesus says, Judas, you betrayed me with a kiss. And Judas doesn't say anything because he's got nothing to say. And Peter, he's by Jesus' side, and we're going to look at this, I think, like late next year. Peter says, well, this is it. I guess we're going out. And he pulls out his sword, and he goes to cut somebody's head off, and he misses, and he cuts off the ear of the scribe of the high priest. And Jesus picks it up, and he sticks it back on. And what does he say to Peter? He says, put your sword away. For those who live by the sword, what? Die by the sword. If you live obsessed with greed, you know how you're going to go out? Obsessed with greed. If you live with anything, that's how you're going to go out. It's sad because the road you takes you to the location that you might not want. However, there's no getting off that road once you get to that destination. He continues on with this idea of being this animal that's driven to take advantage of people, or that's driven to follow false teaching. And he has this phrase over in verse 14. He just doubles down and he says, they count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. They are spots and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions. They feast with you. They have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. That phrase, eyes full of adultery, it comes from one word. It's adulterous eyes, and it's looking for people to cause to sin. You know, it's the idea of looking out and saying, all right, well, that person's attractive. That ring ain't no thing. I'm going to find a way to get a drink with that person, seduce them, right? And what false teachers do, in their boldness against the commandments of Jesus, is they're always looking for followers. It kind of reminds me, and we're not directly preaching against this, so if you're involved in this, I'm not coming after you. It kind of reminds me of MLM people, or multi-level marketing people. Who here knows what that is? Okay. You guys know what it is without knowing what it is. Has anybody had a friend in high school that they lost contact with, only to get friend requested on Facebook like 15 years later for a business opportunity? Right? That's multi-level marketing, right? It's, hey, I got this really good deal on fill in the blank, Tupperware, really good pants. Oh no, I just watched a documentary on this, not Lululemon, LuLaRoe, there we go. Really good pants, right? Why don't you come out, do this. In Texas, it's even more insidious because you can do multi-level marketing with energy. The energy people that we have here, you can get people to sell it for you. Right? And something I've learned, I have friends who are in multi-level marketing, a lot of people in Plexus. I'm not sure why Plexus, but Plexus, right? Is that whenever I'm talking to them, I always got to be careful, because if the conversation goes the wrong way, it's going to turn into a sales pitch. Do you guys have friends like that? Right? Oh, it's tough, right? I'm like, I really want to be my friend's friend, but man, if we're going to talk and it's going to turn into, hey, you should buy this from me, it's this wonderful cure-all. Well, cure-all, that's snake oil spelt really funny, brother. Well, no, don't worry about it, right? You know what that is? That's eyes full of adultery, right? And a lot of times with false teaching, and false teachers, when they're looking at you, they're not looking at you by your name. They're looking at your wallet. They're looking at you adding to their platform. And he goes on, he has these two last words. He says, their eyes are insatiable. I love that phrase because that's the idea of being thirsty and never getting enough to drink. It's like when you go out to pizza and you come home and you're like, oh man, I might have had a slice too much. I'm going to have a cup of water. And then you're full and still thirsty. So what do? You have another cup of water. And then you're more full and are you still thirsty? Yeah, that's what insatiable is. This thing about false teachers, no matter how many people they get, no matter how big their platform gets, no matter how much money they make, whatever goal they're trying to make, it's never enough. The false teachers that you are following, and hear me on this, you will never be enough. If you subscribe to false teaching, you will never have enough, you will never do enough, you will never be enough. That's where false teaching leads. Let me give an example, one from the Bible and then one from recent history. Verse 15 and 16, Peter ends with a really good example. He talks about this guy called Balaam. Balaam and his donkey. Who here knows about Balaam? All right. Who here was raised in a King James only church and Balaam and his donkey was your favorite Sunday school lesson because it meant you got to swear for the day? Oh, like 5 people. Okay, you know what I'm talking for. Yeah. Balaam and his donkey. Thanks, King James. So let me tell you about Balaam and his donkey, right? So Balaam was a prophet back in the Old Testament, and the prophet's job was to foretell, so preach to Israel, and then forthtell, tell the future. And a lot of times, God would use these men to bless or to curse. And if a blessing was coming down from God, you could bank on it. It was like a check. You knew it was going to happen. If a curse was going to come from God, you could bank on it. It was a check. You knew it was going to happen. So Balaam was this guy where, he was a guy, he was a holy person, he was a preacher, he was supposed to do blessings and curses and all that, and a king of a rival country got a hold of him, and paid Balaam to render a curse against God's people. So he was like, hey, I noticed you've got like this old donkey. How'd you like to have a new mule and a second pair of clothes and money to pay the dowry and a bunch of concubines? And Balaam's like, oh, that sounds really good. And the guy goes, great, just curse your people and I will make your fiscal wildest dreams come true. And Balaam, he doesn't even think about it. He just goes, yes, that's a good idea. Money sounds great. That's the whole reason I got into serving the Lord, is to make money, just like all those preachers in the future. Let's go ahead and do this. So Balaam, he's excited to throw his kinsman under the bus for money. And he's riding his donkey. And what he does to his donkey is he's just hard on his donkey. You know, he yaws it a little bit too hard. He slaps it around. You know, he hits him in the legs rather than feeding him carrot, or feeding him with a stick and a carrot. You know, that whole thing. And what God does is he speaks to Balaam through his donkey. You know, it's neat. He's riding along, and then eventually the donkey just starts speaking to Balaam, and he tells Balaam how much sin he is, not only for mistreating this animal, but also for mistreating the Israelites. And what God does is he strong arms Balaam to apologize to the nation of Israel and to bless them instead. So Israel gets blessed rather than cursed, and they do well rather than this king. Here's what happens to Balaam. Balaam is regarded for the rest of Israelite history and in the New Testament as a turncoat and a wicked guy. So you know how we, like in 2021, say, well, I may be a bad guy, but I'm not like Hitler bad. You guys ever hear that phrase, right? Well, you know, I may have run that kid over, but at least I'm not Hitler, like that kind of thing, right? What they would say back in the Old Testament is, man, I may have done this, but at least I'm not Balaam. And what Peter's doing here is he's pointing out how wicked false teachers is by pointing to a false teacher that really, even though he didn't have a chance to do bad because the Lord stopped him, it was still credited to his account badness because of where his heart was. And what happened was, if Balaam would have pushed all the way out, thousands upon thousands of people who love the Lord would have went underneath the bus. Let me talk about a modern day example of this. There's a podcast I've been listening to, and I will recommend it because I think it's good, called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Mars Hill is one of the fastest growing churches in the nation in the early 2000s. It played a huge part in my life as a believer. And there's a pastor there. I listen to a lot of his sermons. His name is Mark. And I listened to Pastor Mark a lot. When Deb and I drove over here, we listened to his sermon series on the Song of Solomon when we drove from Washington to North Carolina for seminary, right? And what happened was in 2014, it was this huge church. We're talking 20, 30,000 people. They had about 15 campuses scattered along the West Coast. Started 20 people, Bible study, Seattle. And then it had churches up and down the coast. Literally, it seemed overnight, one day, the church just closed. All 14 churches just closed up. And what had happened was, if you go in the news, what it'll say is there was some sort of controversy between Pastor Mark and somebody else, and he was under some sort of church discipline, and then he resigned, and then a month and a half later, all the churches closed up. And there's a lot of confusion over what happened, because apparently God had his hand on that church and on that man, because clearly he must have, because they had, 20, 30,000 people, nationwide meeting, right? Well, what happened was this podcast, this is long-form journalism, actually put on by a guy who did some of the curriculum that we've gone through. His name is Mike Cosper. If you've been in D groups, he's the Imago Dei guy. He's the one who put all that together, right? He started looking at it, and what happened was, behind the scenes, what this gentleman was known for, I believe he's a Christian, but what he was known for was having a very bullying spirit, throwing people under the bus. There's this famous quote he had where he likened the church Mars Hill to the bus, and he says, you're either on the bus or we're going to throw you under the bus, and by the grace of God, there's going to be a mountain of dead bodies behind the Mars Hill bus before we're done. And that's the kind of man and leader this gentleman was. And what happened, what we see in 2014, and this is kind of where he's getting at in the podcast, Mike Cosper, is that all that action, all that following me rather than following Jesus, all that, whose church is it? Well, it's your church, Mark. Whose church is any church, you guys? It's the Lord. It's God's, it's Jesus', it's Yahweh. It's the Lord's. It's never a man's church. All that finally catches up to him. And he's out and he leaves. Now, here's the sad thing, right? I believe he's a brother in Christ. I believe he's a Christian. He's a pastor of a church over in, I think, Scottsdale, Arizona, and they're doing well from what I understand. But what he left in the wake of his teaching, much of it false, were tens of thousands of believers, new believers and older believers, who had a crisis of faith, and a lot of them left the faith in Seattle. I understand the sentiment, but that ain't right. That's not good. You really need to watch who you're following, who you're listening to, because it can potentially shipwreck your faith. You know, theology is good. Bad theology is really bad, right? I got to meet up with Dottie Parks. I got to meet up with MJ over the week. She gave us an Amish rocking chair, and that thing, you'll have to forgive the wordplay, that thing rocks. But we were talking, and apparently she's been checking up on me. And she's like, yeah, you know, your congregation seems to like you pretty good. I'm always relieved to hear that. She goes, they say you're calm and you're funny. And I'm like, well, I've never heard the word calm being ascribed to me, but I'm going to be sure to tell everybody that I am funny, right? But here's where we come back to the weightiness of the sermon and to Peter too. Y'all, you know, I'm happy that if you guys think I'm funny or that I'm calm or that I'm loving, really, hopefully, by the grace of God, I'm leading you to Jesus. And if I ever don't, I don't need to be behind this pulpit. Who you pick as your mentor, as the guy you listen to, as the people you follow on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, the people you listen to on your podcasts, the people you listen to or watch on TBN, or CBN, I think. TBS? No, not them. Yes, I said that, TBN. We're losing momentum. The people you listen to have a direct correlation to where you land as a believer. And we see that in the second half. We'll be a little bit quick on this. False teachers' promises only lead to slavery. I debated using the word slavery because it's not a hot-button topic, but with all the speak of race over the past couple of years, you know, you never want to use the word slavery lightly. And some people would say, well, you know, that's a little bit outdated. I don't think it is, because Peter exclusively uses the word slavery in the same way we as Americans would use the word slavery a couple hundred years ago. And that's the word picture that he's going through. Let me go ahead and read verses 17 through 22 to you guys. He says, 16 through 22, excuse me. He says, these are waterless springs, mists driven by a storm, for the gloom of utter darkness that's been reserved. For speaking loud boasts of folly, they entice by sensual passions of the flesh those who are barely escaping from those who live in error. They promise freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption. And whatever overcomes a person, to that he's enslaved. We'll stop right there, and we'll pick up 20 through 22 at the end. So he continues on, and he starts talking about this idea of slavery. But first, before he gets to this idea of slavery and bondage to whatever your sin is, you know, being handcuffed to the refrigerator, if you're a glutton, being handcuffed to cleaning your internet search history, if you're stuck to porn, right? Being handcuffed to Facebook, if you're a gossip, you know, whatever those things are. He talks about the promises that false teachers make. And here's the thing. One thing that false teachers are good at are making good promises. They are. I love to get those calls saying my auto loan's ready to be paid off, even though I don't have an auto loan. I love that. I love not having credit card debt and getting a phone call saying, hey, your credit card debt could be 0 APR. I'll be like, man, got to buy me a bunch of TVs so I can pay 0 APR. And that sounds great. Those promises sound good, but they're much like dry springs and waterless clouds. What do you mean by that? Over in the Middle East, it was very arid, very dry. And much like now, but a lot more apparent over there, right? You needed, of course, water to survive. You want to be in a wet place. And if you're in a wet place, you want to be in a wet place where where there's not a lot of salt in the water, where there's a good segregation between your salt and your water, right? You know, you guys know that phrase, water, water all around and not a drop to drink? Yeah, absolutely. So what he's saying is all these promises, it's like a mirage. Y'all remember growing up how two things were a bigger concern than you'd think when you were a kid than you were when an adult? Quicksand and mirages, right? You know, when I was like 5, I'd be watching Tom and Jerry, I'd be watching Captain Planet, all these shows, and they'd always be like crawling in a desert. And then one of them would sink and be like, oh, I got to watch for quicksand when I'm 20 because it's going to be all over the place. And then they'd look forward and they'd see a mirage and there'd be like a nice palm tree and everything was kind of wavy and like, a nice pool of water. And then they would crawl over there and what would it be? Just more sand. Man, the kind of frustration that would be? What false teachers are and what they're peddling is a mirage. Those waterless clouds, they're the clouds that look like storms that don't bring water. A couple weeks ago, we were really excited for our first real snow. I thought we were going to get dumped on, get 16 feet of snow or whatever it was. And, those dark clouds were in and we were waiting. I wanted to have a good rocking chair so I could sit on the front porch and talk about how my knees were blowing out because the cold was coming in. Right? But I didn't yet because I didn't have that rocker. I was really excited about it, and we got like a 1/4 inch of snow. And I just felt so, dejected because I couldn't make snowmen, but really happy because I didn't have to shovel my drive, right? That's what false teaching is. Man, hey, I got something really nice for you. Just follow. And then you get there, and lo and behold, it's just more of the same. There's no end. Rather than the end being an oasis or a wonderful shower to cool off the summer heat, what is it instead? It's slavery. It's bondage. He says this, Paul says this over in Romans 8 when he talks about sin. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves to whom you obey, either in sin, which leads to death, or in obedience, which leads to righteousness? As I'm a Christian, I'm a slave to Jesus. I don't answer, it's not my life, it's Jesus's. You say, I don't like that, I want freedom, so I'm not going to become a Christian. You're still a slave to something. Something, I don't know what that something is, runs your life. And what I would say is Jesus makes a better boss, makes a better master, makes a better dad, makes a better Lord than anything else. If I can find it, I'll put it on the rundown. Matt Chandler, he's a preacher out of the Village Church down in Texas. He always gives this really good analogy for sin. And he always likens it to that old show from the 90s and early 2000s called When Animals Attack, right? Does anybody know about that show? If you don't know about that show, you could figure out that show from the title, right? When Animals, or Be Really Fierce. Right? And it always goes like this. It's always the same setup. Usually there's a zookeeper. He's got like a bear or a lion or something, and he's, the bear's doing his thing on his ball, or the lion is just kind of laying down, kind of biding his time. And then the tamer, the person always says, I've got this, I've been doing this for years, and lo and behold, by the end of the clip, homeboy's missing a hand. Right? Homeboy's a Matt Chandlerism. I can't pull off that word very well. And he says that's so much like sin because oftentimes when we look at sin, we have a handle on it. We've been dealing with it for years. But the reality of the matter is it's a lot stronger than we think it is. It just hasn't wrecked our life yet. My seminary professor used to say, jumping off of the Empire State Building would be really fun until the last second. And that's fair. And that's how slavery to sin works. Eventually, you're in so deep, you can't get out, so you got to keep subscribing to this thing. A really good example of this I always think of is Westboro Baptist Church. Westboro Baptist Church is a church that I believe came out of Gainesville, Florida, and they were the guys who, by the way, I don't believe these people are Christians. They were the guys who would go and they would march on soldiers' funerals, and they would have pickets that said, "Thank God for dead soldiers." Now, let me tell you something real quick. That's not in the Bible. That's not found in the Bible. That is not what the Bible teaches. That's not what we as Christians are supposed to do. Hear me on that, okay? So if you ever hear me say, thank God for dead soldiers, that's a thing we want to rally behind, right? No, absolutely. Let's all say that louder so the people on the internet can hear me. So when I say things like, thank God for dead soldiers, that's something we're supposed to rally behind, right? No. Thank you. All right, I'm sure that'll come in handy for a deposition, like in a decade. Right? No, absolutely not. However, there's this interesting TED Talk given by a lady who was in it, and she's talking about her experience, and one of the questions is, why didn't you leave earlier? And the answer was, I've just put so much energy and time into this, I just couldn't. Let's be real about that. We look down on that, to be sure, But let me tell you something. I've put so much time getting to know Dean's brownies into my life over the past year that I can't simply say, oh, nope, that's a thing, and turn it off. When you follow false teachers, it's not as simple as I can quit anytime I want. That's not a thing. And Peter's aware of that. When you follow false teachers all the way down your life, and I'm going to borrow a phrase from the Bible, from Paul, he says your life becomes shipwrecked. 1 Timothy 1, 19 and 20, we looked at this back in April. Paul says, holding the faith in good conscience, by rejecting this, the faith, some have made shipwreck of their faith. Among whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander, and look at the words that Paul uses, among whom I've handed over to Satan that they may learn how to blaspheme. So you're like, what? Does that mean Paul held like a weird seance with like a goat's head and a pentagram? No, he just kind of let them off to do their own thing and left them to their own devices. You know, kind of, you guys ever hear the phrase on the internet, let's just take safety labels off everything and let the problem work itself out, right? That's what Paul's doing with these two men, Hymenaeus and Alexander. Here's the thing. When we're left to our own devices, or when we're left to the devices of a false teacher, who are we handed over to? Well, Satan. Does it ever end well? No. He says this, I'll give this, then I'll give an example, and what we're going to do is we're going to pray and have a very short response and worship, and we'll call it. He ends with this phrase, and we'll sum it up in a sentence. The Christians who become Christians and then follow the false teachers wind up worse than they would have been if they just stayed non-believers. And that's, you know, you read that, and I look at that and I do the head tilt, like how does that even work, right? I'll explain. The modern day example. I had some neighbors growing up, Jeff and Candace, and they gave their lives to Jesus about the same time I did, late 90s. And Jeff and Candace, they were in their 40s, and they owned the house next to us. And I started going to church, they started going to church, and they got really wrapped up into this theology called prosperity theology. That's theology, the theology wrongfully taught that God wants you to be healthy, wealthy, and wise, right? So you plant a seed in faith with money, and God will bless you with money back. It's like a spiritual Ponzi scheme, okay? So Jeff and Candace, that's what they were discipled in, and they were in kind of a fiscal bind, and they knew that the Lord would take care of them if they gave money to their church. So they started writing checks. Right? And eventually, their debt started piling up. So they took out a HELOC, and they started writing checks from their HELOC, right? Home equity line of credit, right? And eventually that got bad, so they went after a second mortgage, writing that seed money, following what they thought were being obedient. Eventually, Jeff and Candace had to declare bankruptcy. And eventually, Jeff and Candace were so angry at each other and at themselves that their marriage ended. Heaven knows what happened to their kids. Not that, they went off to, be slaves or, in a mine somewhere. Just, imagine growing up in that household. Jeff and Candace were in a markedly worse place in their lives due to false teaching than they were had they just been going on their own way. We're not talking about eternal consequences here. What we're talking about is what you go home to in your life. And what Peter warns against here, the reason we need to watch what we watch, listen to who we listen to, give pause to who we give pause to, is because if you start following things, teachers, false teachers that are not connected to the gospel, that misrepresent the gospel, that misrepresent Jesus Christ, your life, your home life, your family, your legacy, like Balaam, it'll be shipwrecked. It'll be ruined. And as your pastor and as your brother, I don't want any of your lives ruined. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much for this day. Thank you so much for the fact that we have your Bible, your word, and the fact that you've blessed us with a good spiritual pedigree, both in our denomination and our church, personal church's history. I pray right now for us. I recognize that this is kind of a cerebral sermon, where you come in feeling bad and the preacher's harping against false teachers. There's not a lot to feel good about. But Lord, I pray right now that you help us feel good about your grace and help us lean into that. Lord, I want to pray right now that you help us worship you in spirit and truth today. Help us lean on you and look to you to be the solver of our problems. Thanks and I love you. In your name I pray, amen. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to sing this very briefly. We're going to go ahead and sing Joy to the World, Joyful, Joyful by Phil Wickham. just the first verse and chorus.